Welcome everyone to Lesson 2 of Hadran's Complete Beginner's Guide to Gemara. Today's class is sponsored by Neri Tischler in loving memory of her father, Emanuel Braverman, mother-in-law and father-in-law, Bluma and Isaac Tischler, Zichronam Livracha. All three of them survived the Shoah and went on to live productive lives in Canada. None of them were particularly religious. In fact, their father was anti-religious, but all valued Jewish education and would have been thrilled with the work that Hadran is doing to make the Talmud accessible to women. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Rabbanit Leah Sarna.
Hi everyone, so good to see so many faces, and I'm so glad to be back with lesson number 2 out of this 3-part series. So just for those of you who weren't with us last time, I'll just kind of review how this is going to go. I'm going to present for about 45-50 minutes. And then after that, we'll have some time for Q&A. The Q&A is going to go through the chat just because, thank God, there's so many people on here, but if you were raising your hand, I probably wouldn't even be able to see it. So you'll just put your questions in the chat once it's time for Q&A, and I'll read those and then answer the ones that I can get to in the time that we have. So this is kind of what we did last time. And last time we started with sort of a history of the oral law and got all the way through up to what is the Talmud Bavli and its kind of closing, let's say, and we're going to complicate that picture in just a few minutes in the year 500. Today we're going to look at the different layers within the Gemara. We're going to talk about how did the Bavli win. Last week or 2 weeks ago, we talked about how there's a Bavli and a Yerushalmi, 2 different Talmuds. How did it become the case that the Bavli became just so much more learned and so much more influential? We'll do that just super briefly. We'll do a quick introduction to the Vilna Shas, which is the publication of the Talmud that is kind of the most classic one studied in yeshivot, and when people think about the Talmud today, it's even if you learn out of a English Koren Steinsaltz or an art scroll, the page of the Vilna Shas is in the book with you. So what is the Vilna Shas? How does it work? What tools are there on the page? And then we're going to put it together by beginning to learn a little bit of Gemara, which is what you're all here for anyways. And so the Gemara we're going to be looking at together is Sukkah 41b. We're not going to make very much headway in it. We'll move very slowly so that we can review some of the concepts that we'll kind of run through at the beginning of this class. And we're actually going to be continuing Sukkah 41b in the next class when we look at some different elements of the Gemara then. So just briefly, I want to walk us through the different layers of the Gemara, and we'll see this when we get to our example in Sukkah 41b. We're gonna see these there. So this is just a list. So the first, and a lot of this will be familiar from last time. So the Gemara has within it Tanaitic sources, and those come in different genres. They come in halachic teachings by Tanaim. They come in the form of midrashim on verses, both halachic midrashim, which we talked about last time, but also agadic midrashim. This pasuk, this verse says these couple of words, and that teaches us this whole story. So those stories, many of them are found in the Talmud itself, as well as in collections of midrashim. You also just have Tanaitic stories. And you have life advice by Tanaim, and all Tanaitic material, almost all of it, is in Hebrew. We spoke last time about how sometimes there's Greek that sort of makes its way in, and the example we mentioned was the well-known word afikomen, which is not a Hebrew word, but makes its appearance in the Mishnah, along with a number of other Greek words. And then the next layer within the Gemara would be Amoraic sources. So those are teachings by Amoraim, and they also come in halachic teachings. You have Amoraic midrashim. We actually saw one last time by Rav Papa. You have stories by and about Amoraim. You have life advice by Amoraim, and those appear in both Aramaic and in Hebrew, but the tell sometimes is the use of Aramaic. And lastly, we have the Stam. So the Stam speaks anonymously. It asks questions. It presents possible answers. It will tie together and compare different earlier statements. So the Gemara will have a statement by a Tana and a statement by an Amora, and the Stam will say, do these disagree or do they actually agree? And maybe here's how. That's a very common move by the Stam. It organizes and orders statements within a given topic. Sometimes the stam will present a summary or a concluding statement. So it will say, the halacha is in accordance with X, hilchata ke, whoever. So-and-so has been refuted, tiyuvta, or the answer is unknown, tegu. It's a tie. That's kind of a modern Hebrew interpretation of the word tegu. The stam is almost always in Aramaic. And scholars today attempt to identify different layers or genres within the stam, and then they'll associate those different layers with different groups of people who they'll name or different periods of time. And there's just so much kind of ongoing scholarly debate about that I'm calling all of it the stam, but you might go to a lecture by an academic and they'll use all kinds of different words for different populations that they've identified within the stam. I wanted you to kind of know that that's a thing that exists, but that's sort of next layer for us. All right, so here's the story of how the Bavli won. So our timeline last time ended in the year 500, and that's where we're picking up today. So we have 100 more years where the Talmud really gets worked over by this group of people called the Savoraim, and some people say, yes, this is when the stam was added into the Talmud, that the stam is Savorai. Some people say, no, the stam is earlier or just one generation of Savorai. It's all very subject to a lot of debate, but almost everyone agrees, even in classical, rather early Jewish sources, agrees that there's sort of 100 years or a couple generations of people who we call Savoraim, who played some kind of editorial role in the Talmud. Starting in the 600s, we have the Muslim Conquest. And the Muslim Conquest means, among many other things, obviously, that 90% of world Jewry at that time are living under Islamic rule. That's when we start to see the rise of communities in Egypt, Spain, North Africa, Jewish communities, obviously, in Egypt, Spain, and North Africa. And at the beginning, and people who love the Cairo Geniza might already know this. At the beginning, in some of those communities, you would actually have sort of people who followed the traditions of Eretz Yisrael. The main synagogue where the Cairo Geniza was found was, people think, at least at the beginning, a synagogue that followed the traditions of Eretz Yisrael. And then across the street, you would have a synagogue of the people who followed the traditions of Bavel. But over time, especially because you have basically all of world Jewry living under this one sort of unified rule, the Gaonim were the heads of the major Babylonian academies, some of those same academies as we find stories and stories about in the Talmud. They sort of become the center of Jewish knowledge. So when communities that aren't in Surah and Pumbedita or whatever have questions, how should we act? How should we daven? There's a judicial case between person A and person B, and we don't know how to rule. They would send, and this is the beginnings of responsa literature, they would send questions to the Gaonim, who would then respond. And those responses were often based on their readings and interpretations of the Babylonian Talmud. So the centrality of the Gaonim within this almost like global Jewish community living under Muslim rule is a big piece of that story of how the Talmud Bavli ended up winning. And then only about 300 years later do we start to have the rise of communities in Ashkenaz. But again, already in this time where the Gaonim are sort of this supreme halachic and interpretive force in the world. And then already by the year 1000, in the 1000s, that's already the First Crusade, and the communities in Ashkenaz are already under attack, even though they're sort of still fledgling compared to some of the older communities like the ones in Spain. And then we have Rashi, and Rashi brought, and we'll talk more about Rashi later, but Rashi brought a revolution to the Talmud Bavli that makes the Talmud Bavli so accessible to other readers, and made possible the project of his grandsons and lots of other people for the next 200 years that gets eventually collected into a commentary called the Tosfot. And we'll talk more today also about who the Tosfot are. But by the time of Rashi didn't even have, most scholars believe, Rashi didn't even have the Yerushalmi. When Rashi quotes the Yerushalmi, he always quotes it like, I learned from this guy that the Yerushalmi on this subject says this. So that means that he either had only fractions of the Yerushalmi or he didn't have it at all and was learning it secondhand. Tosfot do more frequently quote the Yerushalmi. But by the time of Rashi, it's very clear that the Bavli reigns supreme. Okay, the next thing I want to talk about is the Vilna Shas. The Vilna Shas was printed by the Widow and Brothers Ram Publishing House. It was completed in 1886. One thing that I just love telling to women who are learners of the Talmud is that at that time, the Ram Publishing House was run by a woman. Her name was Devorah Ram. She was a brilliant businesswoman, and she made possible the Talmud that we all study. She made that Talmud possible. So every word and every page has a woman's hand in it. And the Vilna Shas was this amazing project. It was a 20-year-long project of careful proofreading. They found all of these manuscripts, textual variants that weren't found in any previous printing. So at the time, it was the most corrected text of the Bavli available. They included many more commentaries than any previous edition. I brought you here a picture and you can find this usually even in the most modern, this is an Oz Vahadar printing of the Gemara, and even in these new modern printings, they'll still have the Sharblat, the opening had a page from the Vilna Shas, and it will give credit to Ha'almanah v'ha'achim Ram, widow and brothers Ram, and that Almanah is Devorah Ram. Okay, so what's on the page? I brought you this rather inelegant picture because you actually need to be able to see the binding. You need to be able to see this crease down the middle of the page in order to understand how to navigate the pages of the Vilna Shas. So when we talk about the pages, when you open a Vilna Shas, these pages are mirrors of each other. So we talk about things that are on the outside and things that are on the inside, or things that are on away from the binding and close to the binding. We can't just say Rashi is on the left, because half the time Rashi is on the left and half the time Rashi is on the right. So we talk about outside and inside when we talk about the pages of the Gemara. And the reason for that is that in any book, the part closest to the binding is the most protected part of the book. Meaning if a mouse were going to nibble on your book, the parts closer to the binding would be safe. If your book were to get a little bit of water on it, the parts closest to the binding would be safe. So we put kind of the most important stuff obviously is in the middle. So you'll know what the most important stuff is. But other than that, we put other important things in the middle in order to protect it. So that's just a little bit about the history of books and publishing. So here's what's on the page. When you're looking for a page number, that's going to be this, and it's on the top outer corner. Chapter name and number are going to be across the middle here, and we'll have more visuals where you'll get a chance to look at this more closely. The Mishnah and the Gemara are this part right here in the middle of the page. Then Rashi is going to be the column closest to the binding. So if this is the binding down the middle here, this guy wrapping around here, this middle column, that's Rashi. And then Tosfot is the outside column. So that this is Tosfot. Okay. The Ein Mishpat, and we'll get to who he is and what he does, but the Ein Mishpat is in the top margin for this from the binding. So that's over here. The Masoret Hashas is the top margin closest to the binding. So here the Masoret Hashas is actually going down the side here. The Torah Or in classic printings, in the earlier printings, is actually right here, squished in the middle between Rashi and the Gemara. Newer editions have the Torah Or Hashalim, which is in a further out margin, and we'll talk more about who the Torah Or is and what he does. And then every different tractate of the Gemara has other different marginalia. So we'll have characters like Rabbeinu Chananel, Hagaud Bach, Gilyon Hashas, lots of other people. But those are kind of the major, most important, what I would call most important tools on the page of the Vilna Shas. Okay, so here's just like a pretty version, and this is the image that we're going to come back to as we kind of meet these characters one by one. And we're going to put that all together by looking closely at Sukkah 41b. Now you might say, oh, why did you choose Sukkah 41b? Is Sukkah 41b like some sort of classic, super important text? And the answer is No, it's not. I like Sukkah 41b because it's a great exemplar of lots of the things that I wanted to show you, and it does it pretty concisely. So that's why we're in Sukkah 41b. There's nothing magical or mystical about Sukkah 41b, but it's accessible and it provides great examples, boom, 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 one after the other. And that's why we'll be looking at it as our example for today and also for next week. All right. So the Mishnah, within the context of the Gemara, you can see the Mishnah and this is actually our page. This is Sukkah 41b, and you can see the Mishnah here in the middle. The Mishnah is introduced by the bolded letters Mem, Tav, Nun, Yud, which is an abbreviation of the word matnitin, which means our Mishnah. The Mishnah is always found in the center column, same as the Gemara. So sometimes you'll have in the middle column Mishnah, and then it will be followed by Gemara. You'll have Gemara followed by Mishnah. All of that is happening in that center column in the middle of the page. In a collection of just Mishnah, so last time we saw a manuscript, that was the Kaufman manuscript, that was just the Mishnah. So in those types of collections, if you're studying Mishnayot for a Shloshim or other times when Mishnayot are classically studied, you're not going to open up a Gemara and a Talmud and just flip through to the Mishnayot. That would be a very annoying way of learning Mishnah. You would open up a book that's just Mishnah and you would learn the Mishnah maybe with some commentary or translation. In any event, in that collection that is just Mishnayot, the Mishnayot are numbered. In the Talmud, Mishnayot are not numbered, but they're still found in the same order and in the same chapters. So in a book that was just Mishnayot, if you opened to the Mishnayot of Masachet Sukkah, the Mishnah on our page on Sukkah 41b would be found in chapter 3, Mishnayot 13 and 14. In the Talmud, we're still in Sukkah chapter 3, but we wouldn't use that Mishnah 13, Mishnah 14 designation. That wouldn't help you find the Mishnah. And in fact, the Talmud teaches them as if they're one Mishnah without really any separation between them. And so in the Talmud, we would just refer to it as the Mishnah on Sukkah, page 41b. We wouldn't refer, if I said to you, find in the Talmud Mishnah Sukkah, chapter 3, 13 through 14, you would have to know what that Mishnah was and then search for it page after page until you found it. That would be very annoying. Versus if I told you it's the Mishnah on Sukkah 41b, you'd open to 41b, you would see, boom, it says Mem, Tav, Nun, Yud in big, bold letters. That's the Mishnah I'm looking for. So the numberings of the Mishnayot, we don't really use when we're learning Mishnah in the context of Gemara. All right, but here is our Mishnah, and I want us to learn it together. Okay, so Yom Tov, the case is Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag Shachal Hiyot B'Shabbat. So it's the first day of Sukkot. Sukkot often in the Mishnah and in the Gemara is just referred to as Chag. So it's the festival of Sukkot, and it falls out, the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbat. What should people do, or what do people do? Kol ha'am molichin et lulaveihem b'beit hakneset. So all the people bring their lulavim to the synagogue, and the implication is that they do that on Friday. Then lemacharat on Shabbat, on the first day of Yantiv, mashkimim uvain kol echad ve'echad mekirat shelo v'nuslo. The next day, everyone wakes up, they go to shul, everyone recognizes their own lulav, and they take it. Because the concern is you can't carry it to shul with you on Shabbat because you'll be carrying through the public domain on Shabbat, and that's prohibited. So you have to bring it in advance, but you have to recognize your own lulav and take it again then. So why? Why do you have to make sure you take your own? Because, and now we have not a case, but a principle. The sages said, "In Adam yotzei yedei chovato b'yom tov harishon be'lulavo shel chavero." A person does not fulfill his obligation to take his lulav on the first day of the festival with the lulav of another person. But ushar yamot hachag, but on other days of Sukkot, Adam yotzei yedei chovato be'lulavo shel chavero. A person does fulfill his obligation even with the lulav of another. Now you're going to say in your head, hold on, if Sukkot falls on Shabbos, we don't take lulav and etrog now on that day. And that is true for today. And That is not true within the confines of this Mishnah. This Mishnah is talking about a time when they did, and this is how they did it. Okay, so I want to point out a few things about our Mishnah. So the Mishnah is mostly an anonymous statement, and the speaker there, we would refer to that speaker as the Tanakama, the anonymous first voice of the Mishnah. The Gemara very frequently refers to the Tanakama, like that is a Gemara language about the Mishnah. So it's useful to know, when it says like, who is the Tanakama, or what is the opinion of the Tanakama? They're talking about this anonymous voice in the Mishnah that we just heard loud and clear. And then we had a principle put forward by the sages or the Chachamim, and that's an anonymous majority opinion of the Tanaim. There's lots of different kind of suppositions about who exactly that is or when or whatever, but for our purposes, all you need to know is that it's a majority opinion, and majority opinions are important because in the oral Torah, we follow the Torah's principle of acharei rabim lahatu, to follow the majority. So when you have a majority opinion, that's a very kind of powerful and important opinion. Then the Mishnah, all of that is kind of background. The Mishnah raises a case. So our case is the first day of Sukkot falls out on Shabbat. And then the Mishnah will tell you what you're supposed to do about it. And that is an extremely common form of Mishnah. So scholars in English like to describe the Mishnah as like casuistic, which just means the Mishnah spends a lot of time talking about cases. That's how the Mishnah teaches. But it also has principles, and that's the other thing we saw here. So it's a principle was quoted by the Chachamim. And you'll also notice that not a single pasuk was brought in as evidence. No verses are cited here. It's just, here's the case, here's what you're supposed to do about it, and here's a principle that is also taught that sort of aligns with why this is. All right, so now we're going to move on to the Gemara. The Gemara, and you can see here where that starts, it's introduced by the bolded letters Gimel Mem, Chupchik, which is just an abbreviation of the word Gemara. The Gemara is also always found in the center column, same as the Mishnah, and the Gemara's discussions of the Mishnah can take all kinds of forms. They can be narrow, they can be wide, long, short, legal, narrative, winding, straightforward, and all of this variety is what makes the Gemara so kind of joyful and exciting to learn. All right, so we're just going to actually get through a very tiny amount of Gemara in the rest of our time together today, because we're going to go through it very slowly and point out lots of things and jump to some of the different tools in the Vilna Shas as we move forward. Okay, so I just put this little piece of Gemara up here, but you can also see it here. And you'll notice that the Gemara does not have any punctuation. It does not have any vowels. It does not have quotation marks. So what that means is when you're learning an edition, when you're learning from, let's say, the Steinsaltz edition of the Gemara, which has added in punctuation, vowels, quotation marks, all of that is late. It doesn't appear in manuscripts. That is, and the Steinsaltz editions of the Gemara say that it's annotated and punctuated by Rabbi Steinsaltz and his team. So when you see that, that's relatively recent addition. It's a learning tool, which is amazing and so helpful for learners. But even in the printings of the Vilna Shas does not contain any of those things. And there's upsides and downsides to having that on the page with you. So when you're learning Daf Yomi and you just want one reading of what's happening on the page so that you can get through it in a reasonable amount of time and get to tomorrow, then learning with punctuation, vowels, quotation marks is essential and so helpful. But when you're learning slowly and you want to deeply understand all of the disputes that the medieval and modern commentators have about the text, you can't learn it with punctuation and vowels and quotation marks because so many of their disputes take root in part in where they put the punctuation and the vowel marks. So sometimes you'll have Rashi saying, here there should go a question mark. And then someone else will come and say, no, that a question mark doesn't go there. It's different. Read it with a different kind of intonation. And those kinds of debates make a lot of sense if you know that the Gemara does not have punctuation in it, and make no sense if you're looking at a version of the Gemara that has punctuation in it. So you have to, if you're learning Gemara for very slowly in maybe what we would call in the yeshiva iyun style Gemara, you actually want to leave open all of the ambiguities of how to possibly read the text by using an addition that does not have punctuation, vowels, quotation marks. And then you'll sit there with a pencil and you'll add in your own suggestions of where do the different punctuation marks go. And that's also part of the fun of being a learner of the Talmud. The other thing, obviously, that I have up here and didn't mention yet is that the Gemara is also a mix of Aramaic and Hebrew, and the Gemara over here that we'll start to look at in just a moment is also a mix of Aramaic and Hebrew. All right, so we're going to break it down very slowly. So one of the Gemara's most common questions about the Mishnah is our Gemara's opening shot. So the Gemara says, Mina hane mili, from where are these matters derived? This question is in Aramaic. These are Aramaic words, Mina hane mili. So as we mentioned just a second ago, the Gemara does not contain question marks, but a reader who has facility with the language of the Gemara will know that these are question words. So the same way that a reader in English would know that a sentence that begins with where should have a question mark at the end, even if maybe it came through in a text message and the person didn't use punctuation, you would still know that it's a question because there are words that can signify questions. So too, in the Gemara, one of the ways that we come to a guess as to how to punctuate is through words that signify questions. So Mina hane mili is a question phrase. This question, in our case, is posed by the stam of the Gemara. We know this because it's an unnamed voice within the Gemara, and it's posing a type of question that's extremely typical of the stam to pose. The question is so common that it's sometimes abbreviated to just mem hey mem, Mina hane mili, mem hey mem. And the reader recognizes that that's how the Talmud is asking about the source of a law. Abbreviations, as you likely know, are extremely common in Hebrew printing. They save space. If you are trying to get all your words to fit into a certain shape or onto a certain page, then you'll use abbreviations to help make that happen. Also, anything that was a manuscript means that someone was writing it in this very expensive fashion with ink by hand on expensive paper materials. And that means that anytime you can use abbreviations, or in Hebrew, Rashi Script, you're going to. Different editions of the Talmud have more and less, but the Vilna Shas actually has relatively few, which is a great help to readers. And then if you use, let's say, a Steinsaltz or an Art Scroll, they kind of fill those out for you. But if you come across a Rashi Script, an abbreviation, and you don't recognize it, there's whole books of just kind of rabbinic Rashi Script. They're often called Otsar Rashi Script, or you can also nowadays Google it, and that will typically help you out. So that's just another tool to have in your toolkit. The Gemara contains sort of two major types of questions. So some are curiosity questions, and then some are attack questions. So curiosity questions might be, where is this law from? And that what you would call a be'iyah, a curiosity question. And then there's also a kushya, which would be an attack question, like you stated this law, but I have an earlier source that states the opposite law. And the implication is, you're wrong. And that would be a kushya, and we'll get to some of those later on in our page next week. So those are attack questions, and they use different kinds of vocabulary typically, not always, but often, to set up the two different types of questions. So Mina hane mili is almost always a be'iyah, a curiosity type of question vocabulary. Now, after having read just these three words, you might still have questions such as, okay, we described hane mili, these matters, but that involves a pronoun of these. And what is that pronoun referencing? Which matters exactly is the Gemara interested in? That's a great question. So here's where Rashi comes in. These little questions that just are the whole difference between do I understand what's happening and do I not understand what's happening. Those are exactly the type of things that Rashi, who lived in Provence the years 1040 to 1105, the classic joke is those are the most important 25 minutes in all of Jewish history, 1040 to 1105. Okay. And Rashi comes along to fill in those little reader questions. And that's the brilliance of Rashi, that Rashi really took the Gemara from a text with lots and lots and lots of little ambiguities and holes to a text that a person can actually read. So if you're, let's say you're a person who uses the English Steinsaltz, so you'll know that in the English translation, there's all these bolded words and then the not bolded words. So the way to think about Rashi is the not bolded words. And in fact, most of those not bolded words are just straightforward translations of Rashi. So that's just to kind of understand what Rashi 1,000 years ago contributed to our Talmud study. So he comes along to fill those in. Rashi is most of the time extremely short, extremely to the point, but fills in these essential gaps that makes the Gemara possible to understand. Rashi's comments begin with what's called a dibur hamatchil. There's like a Latin term that's not even worth introducing that means dibur hamatchil, but basically what it is it's a opening citation. And what that helps you know is you know exactly which words he's commenting on. So if you look here at the Rashi, you'll see that there's some bolded words. And I'll give you a close-up of this soon. You'll see that there's some bolded words and some not bolded words within the Rashi. So the bolded words are the dibur hamachil. That's that opening citation. And that's how you know which part of the Gemara Rashi is talking about. But the tricky piece is that sometimes when you're reading Rashi, you're supposed to read the dibur hamachil as part of his comment. Like the next words just kind of flow straight from the words of the Gemara. And sometimes you're supposed to read the dibur hamachil as just, okay, this is what we're talking about. And the sentence actually begins after that opening citation, after that dibur hamachil. So one of the tricky issues as a reader of Rashi is sort of just figuring out where does the sentence begin. And that's always a question you want to ask yourself when you're reading Rashi. Rashi is typically printed in Rashi Script. Rashi Script is just another font, and it's used so that you can easily tell the difference between the Talmud's text and commentary. It's the same font used often in printings of Rashi on the Chumash or on the Tanakh. And there too, it's just so you know that Rashi is not the Chumash or the Tanakh, it's a commentary. People often say, oh, it's Rashi's handwriting. It is not Rashi's handwriting. It's just another font option. Okay, so here's Rashi. So the Stam asks, Menahani Mili, from where are these matters derived? And we have a question, which matters? What these matters? What's the reference of those pronouns these? So here's Rashi, and I brought it for you. And I brought you kind of I brought it as a screenshot and like a bigger thing, so you can just have a sense of how sort of brief it is. This is the first Rashi on our Gemara. So Rashi will tell you, oh, my comments on the Mishnah are over. Here are my comments on the Gemara. So he too begins his comments on the Gemara with just this big Gimel Mem for Gemara. And then here's the dibur hamachil, the opening citation. From where are these matters derived? Menahani Mili. And Rashi goes on to say, Ein Adam yotzet belulav chavero, that a person cannot fulfill the obligation of lulav by using his fellow's lulav. So I said we always have to ask, is the opening citation where the sentence begins, or does the sentence begin after? And here you could kind of read it both ways. This is like a pretty gentle one, but you can definitely read it straight, right? From where are these matters derived that a person cannot fulfill the obligation of lulav with his fellow's lulav? So if I had to say one or the other, I think you could really do both here, but I would say start reading from Menahani Mili, and that would give you kind of the full sentence of the Rashi in this case. Okay, moving on to our next two words. I promised we would move slowly, and lo we are. Okay, so Menahani Mili, from where are these words derived? The Tanu Rabbanan. It is as the sages taught. It is as our sages taught. So this phrase, the Tanu Rabbanan, also an extremely common phrase it almost always introduces a baraita. So last time we spoke at length about what is a baraita. A baraita is a Tannaitic text that was not included in the Mishnah. So this phrase introduces a baraita, and it's typically used to introduce baraitot that begin with anonymous opinions. So it would be kind of weird to say it is as our sages taught, Rabbi Meir taught, blah, 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 right? So instead it's as our sages taught, and then it begins anonymously. The baraita that follows is being brought to answer the question posed by the stam, right? So the stam poses a question, and then the next thing that happens is it brings an answer. And Tanura Banan is, again, one of these extremely common phrases in the Gemara, so common that it's, again, also very frequently abbreviated to Tav Reish, that a student of the Gemara is just supposed to know means Tanura Banan. Okay, so it's as our sages taught. And now we begin our baraita. So, and you shall take. Now, if you did not know anything other than these couple of words that we have read, you would be so confused. What is this and you shall take? So what you have to understand is that and you shall take is really like a hyperlink to an entire verse that you're just supposed to know. So how are you supposed to know what the verse is? I'm going to show you what the verse is, and then I'm going to tell you how you could find out. Okay, so this and you shall take, it's a quote from Vayikra 23:40. And here's what it is. Ulakachtam lachem beyom harishon. On the first day of the holiday of Sukkot, you shall take pre-eitz hadar, the product of hadar trees. That's typically understood to be the etrog. Kapot tamarim, branches of the palm tree, typically understood to be the lulav. Anaf eitz avot, ba'arvei nachal, boughs of leafy trees and willows of the brook. Those are Hadassim and Aravot, and you shall rejoice before Hashem your God 7 days. Usmachtem lifnei Hashem Elokechem Shivat Yamin. Now, as we mentioned last time, the Talmud assumes that you know the whole Tanakh by heart. So here it just quotes one word. It's in the context of lulav, so it's like the lulav word. And it just assumes that you know the rest, you know the whole context, you know what it's talking about, you know that it's about this verse, that's the verse that tells you to take a lulav and etrog on Sukkot, and then it's going to just learn stuff out from it without ever telling you the whole verse. Now, for many of us, that is really hard because we do not, unfortunately, not yet, of course I should say, we do not yet know the whole Tanakh by heart. So how are we supposed to recognize it? So thank God the Vilna Shas has an amazing tool available to us, and it's a tool that has been improved over the years in later editions of the Vilna Shas. So it contains a handy notation called the Torah or, which either tells you where to look. So it might just tell you Vayikra 23, and then you would have to, this is how I grew up learning, you would have to open your Tanakh to Vayikra 23, and you'd have to read through all of Vayikra 23, which is, I might add, quite a long chapter, until you got to the word ulakachtem, and then you would know that's what we're talking about. Or we have newer editions, fancy new editions, which quote the whole verse. Now, I do want to mention one thing about this, which is that when the Gemara assumes you know the whole verse, they don't just assume you know the whole verse. They assume you know the whole context, the whole chapter, everything else that's going on. So when the Torah or Hashalim, the complete Torah or, brings you just the one verse, sometimes that's like really not enough. And sometimes you really do still have to open it up, but it'll tell you exactly which verse it is. So it won't just tell you Vayikra 23. It'll tell you, more specifically where to look, and maybe you just look a few verses before, a few verses after. You remind yourself what's going on because maybe you're familiar with Parshat Emor already, and then you kind of keep going. But I would say, don't get tripped up by saying, "Oh, I know this whole verse. Now I'm an expert." Sometimes the Gemara really assumes you know a lot more. Anyways, fine. The other tool that we have available to us is the Masoret Hashas. So I showed you here the Torah or is in this beautifully designed page in red. So the Masoret Hashas is, I didn't make this beautifully designed page, by the way. Thank you, Maggie. And the Masoret Hashas is up here in yellow. So that's what the Torah or does. The Masoret Hashas will tell you where else in the Talmud you might find this quotation. And that's also very useful and very cool. And both are noted within the text of the Talmud. So again, here, and I'll zoom in on this, but you can see here's where my cursor is. I'm in the purple part of the Gemara. You can see our word. And then next to the word, we have these two, it's very hard to see here, but I'll blow it up in a second. We have these two little superscripts. So superscripts are little letters that are kind of like halfway above text. Like think about like if you're reading a book in English and there's footnotes. So those little footnote notations, those are superscripts also, just a fancy word. Okay, so this is what we're talking about. This is these are our little superscripts. So we have a vav, and that vav is paired with a little like half parenthetical, and then we also have a 2. And so all of the different things on the page that different superscripts correspond to use different fonts or maybe different kinds of numerals. So right here we have a Hebrew numeral and an Arabic numeral next to each other, and that's how you sort of tell them apart. But you'll see from within the middle part of the page where the Gemara is, you'll see that and you'll say, oh, there's a Torah or on here. Amazing. Let me go. That's what the 2 is. Let me jump over to the Torah or to find that full verse. Because otherwise, without the Torah or, you might not even know that we're even talking about a verse at all, right? You might just say, okay, it's a word. It says, and you shall take. Cool. That's the Breita's just using this word. You wouldn't even know that there's a quotation because, again, there's no quotation marks written into the page. Okay, so where does this vav and this 2 bring you? So the 2 would bring you to the Torah or Hashalim, and here you have L'kachtem lachem b'yom harishon pri tzedar kabot tvarim and afit zavot arvei nachal smachtem l'vnei Hashem l'kichem shiva yamim. Good. And the vav takes you up to the Masoret HaShas. The Masoret HaShas wants you to know that further on in our own Gemara in Sukkah on page Mem Gimel Amud Aleph 43a, you can find this same Baraita, and actually there you can find more of it or in a slightly different format. It's very useful to look at them, to follow the Masoret HaShas sometimes. And you can often find even the same text, but in a different context. And sometimes that is in its more original context, which then helps you understand it better. So Masoret HaShas is also a phenomenally useful tool on the page of the Bavli. Okay. All right. Moving on in our Gemara. Okay. So where are these words from? They're from we have a Breita that teaches Ulakachtem, which is a verse from Vayikra 23, you should take. So when the verse says, here we have, the Baraita is a Midrash Halacha, which means that it is going to take a quote from a verse and tie it into a Halacha. So Ulakachtem, and you shall take, means that the taking needs to happen by you. Biyad kol achad be'achad. The taking of a lulav needs to happen by each individual. Now you might remember that the next word in the verse is ulakachtem lachem. You shall take for yourself. So the Midrash Halacha then quotes the next word in the pasuk, lachem, and interprets mishalachem. You should take it for yourself, meaning Lehutzi et hasha'ul ve'et hagazul. So when, right, and it's a good question on the verse. Why does it not just say ulakachtem? Why does it say ulakachtem lachem? Take them for yourselves. So the Midrash understands that when it repeats this for yourself, it means of your own. And that comes to teach that you cannot use, at least on the first day of Sukkot, you cannot use Lehutzi et hasha'ul ve'et hagazul. You cannot use a borrowed or a stolen lulav. Incidentally, last time, again, we spoke about how these Midrashei Halacha, there's also like collections that are just Midrashei Halacha. So if you wanted to find this Midrash Halacha, this Baraita, in a collection of Midrashei Halacha, it appears in the Sifra on Parshat Emor 16:2. And, it's actually, once upon a time, it was very, challenging. You really needed to have like this massive knowledge in order to match Baraito to their collections in, let's say, Midrashei Halacha. But nowadays, there's a great tool. So you can go on Sefaria to the verse in question. So open up Parshat Emor on Sefaria, And then on that verse, you can just click the Midrash link, and you just have to like boop around for a minute or two, and you'll find, if it's there, you'll find it on Sefaria. So that's just like a phenomenal tool that we have in our times. Okay. Now I want to go to another tool that's on the page of the Vilna Shas called the Ein Mishpat. So what does the Ein Mishpat do? The Ein Mishpat tells you where a certain law that's discussed in the Gemara appears in other codes of Jewish law. So it'll tell you whether something on the page is in the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, whether it's in the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol or the Shulchan Aruch. Now, even without actually opening up the Rambam's Mishnah Torah or opening up the Shulchan Aruch, anytime you see an Ein Mishpat superscript, and in almost all editions, the Ein Mishpat superscript is a bolded block case Hebrew letter. You don't have to remember that, but whatever. You'll know that the opinion that follows is the halacha, at least according to some authorities, which is very useful because the truth of the matter is that you can learn so much Gemara and have no idea how to behave in the world as a Jew who observes halacha. And so the Ein Mishpat is kind of like the link between the Gemara and halacha as kind of normatively encoded and then practiced. So here's just an example. So this is the Gemara. Lachem, take for yourself, mishalachem, from your own, and that excludes using a borrowed or stolen lulav. And here's our bet, big bolded block case superscript. And where does that take you? That takes you to the Ein Mishpat. And the Ein Mishpat here, you know you're an expert when you can actually make sense out of all of the incredible abbreviations in the Ein Mishpat, but I'll just read it for you. So you follow that bet. Mem Yud Yud stands for Maimon. So that's the Rambam's Mishnah Torah in the 8th chapter of Hilchot Lulav, Halacha Yud. So 8-10 within the Rambam's laws of the Lulav. That's where you would go for that. If you wanted to be in the Smag, that's the next word, the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, you would look up in the positive commandments, number 44. And this abbreviation stands for Tur Shulchan Aruch. And this is Orech Chaim. So in the first, the Tur Shulchan Aruch has 4 Turim. Whatever, we can do an introduction to the Tur Shulchan Aruch another time. It's one of my favorite books in the Jewish library. So it's divided into 4 sections. So it's the first section, and then Siman Taf Reish Nun Chet Seif Gimel, and another place also Siman Taf Reish Mem Tet Seif Bet. Anyways, you know you're a Jewish library pro, and you can follow this with ease. Takes a little bit of practice, but that's the Ein Mishpat, and that's just a really important little. Even just seeing that bolded bet superscript, you're gonna know, oh, I have to take really seriously that my lulav on the first day of Sukkot needs to actually belong to me. Okay, now we're going to keep going. So next, the Baraita is going to quote a principle based on our Midrash Halacha. So Mikan Amru Chachamim, from here our sages teach. And again, it's the same Chachamim as what we said about in the Mishnah, because this is also material from that same time period as the Mishnah. This is Tanaitic material. So Mikan Amru Chachamim, from here our sages say, In Adam Yotzei Yedei Chovato B'Yom Tov Harishon Shel Chag, a person cannot fulfill his obligation on the first day of Sukkot, Be'lulavo Shel Chavero, with a lulav of his fellow, Ela Im Kain Notno Lo B'Matana, unless he has given it to him, unless the owner has given it to you as a gift. Now, this might sound very familiar because in our Mishnah, the sages, the Chachamim, are quoted as stating a very similar principle. So the principle there is a person does not fulfill his obligation to take lulav on the first day of the festival with the lulav of another. But our Braita adds in something so important. This Ela im kein nolo b'matana, unless the other gave it to him as a gift, is a super important caveat, because it means, oh no, I live somewhere where etrogim don't grow, and I can't afford my own. Am I just supposed to not do lulav and etrog? No, I can receive it from a fellow as a gift. And that is a super important halachic addition to our conversation. Now, this is very common where you have a Braita that has almost the same material as the Mishnah, but just expands it a little bit in a super important and transformative way. In this case, it's clear, right, that the Braita is adding an element to the Mishnah that does not conflict with the Mishnah. Sometimes it'll be ambiguous. Does the added material in the Braita, yes, conflict with the Mishnah or not conflict with the Mishnah? Kind of depends how you read it. And sometimes it's very clearly in conflict with the Mishnah. So in our case, it's not. It's just adding. You could really read both together totally happily, and one doesn't dismiss the other. But it's very, very common for Baraito to be like A and not A, you know, like the total opposite of what the Mishnah said. And that's where the Gemara is going to have to play this very heavy role in trying to figure out, yes, well, they're according to different opinions or different houses. Oh, actually, the Mishnah should be read in this other way. The Gemara sometimes even amends the Mishnah or suggests an emendation to the Mishnah in order to make it fit with a Baraita. So here we have like this very peaceful Baraita. It doesn't drop a bomb into the conversation, but sometimes Baraita can be very powerful, and that will drive pages and pages of discussion within the Gemara. Okay, so now I want to introduce you to one other very important character, and this is the last person we're going to meet today, but this is Tosfot. Referring to Tosfot in the singular is obviously inappropriate. Tosfot is a whole community of people stretching over 200 years. And what did the Tosfot do? So the Tosfot continued the project of Rashi. So they explained the Talmudic text. But in addition to that, because some people say, and it's pretty convincing, that they actually were only able to do their project because Rashi existed, right? So step one, Rashi kind of makes the whole Talmud readable. And then step two, you can actually know the whole Talmud. And then you can do this work of knitting the whole Talmud together. So when you're sitting in a Gemara in Sukkah, you can actually ask a question on that Gemara in Sukkah from a Gemara in a totally different part of Shas that's talking about something totally different, but might seem related, which is what we're going to see in a second. So it really knits the Talmud together and expects the Talmud to kind of all make sense in one kind of unified whole, and then works really hard to try and understand and make that happen. So the Tosfot work really hard to kind of resolve contradictions or make sense of things that seem contradictory within the Talmud. Tosfot often ask these bigger philosophical or conceptual questions about the text. So and that's a main reason why studying the Tosfot has become really a backbone of almost all yeshiva level Talmud study, is because those philosophical and conceptual questions that Tosfot break open are just so exciting and thrilling to learn. And in addition to being commentators, though, Tosfot are also halachists. So if you said, is Rashi a halachist or not, there's huge debates up until today about whether Rashi is a halachist or just a commentator. He's just trying to make sense of the Gemara, and he's not trying to tell you through his commentary on the Gemara how to live your life. But the Tosfot commentary on the Gemara, absolutely, everyone would say it absolutely is a halachic text. And they take particular interest in comparing the Gemara to the lived practices of their own communities. So that's mostly, they're in Provence, so that's mostly France, but other parts of Europe too. We know of some Tosfot who lived even in England before the Jews were expelled from England. We know of Tosfot who were in Germany, all sorts of different places. And trying to fit those two together when there's apparent contradictions between how Jews behave on the one hand and what the Talmud seems to think Jews should be doing on the other hand. And like Rashi, Tosfot is almost always printed in Rashi Script, and it uses that same style of Dibur HaMatchil. So you won't have a superscript within the text telling you, look at Tosfot. You'll just have to know Tosfot uses the Dibur HaMatchil, and if you're curious what Tosfot say, check to see whether you can find one. And that's also how you know what part of the text a Tosfot is using as their kind of jumping off point for what can be very long, wide-ranging discussions within the Tosfot. Okay, so here's our Tosfot. We're not going to actually read all the way through it, but I did want to just point out a few things from it. So the Tosfot's talking about this added line of the Baraita, notin lo b'matana, unless The other gave it to him as a gift. So the Tosfot's going to say, our Gemara here is talking about lulav, but the same rules apply to etrog, and we see that in this Gemara in the chapter Yesh Nochlin. So I mentioned last time that the pagination, the standard pagination of the Talmud, it doesn't appear until the 1500s, which is after the Tosfot with the Bomberg printing of the Talmud. That's when we start to have the standard page numbering within the Talmud. So when the Tosfot, who are writing 200 years, let's say 300 years before that, when they want to tell you where to find something, the best they can do is just tell you what chapter it's in. So and approximately where in the chapter it is. So they tell you, if you want to see what we're talking about, look up in Perek Yesh Nochlin, and then you would have to know what part of the Gemara Yesh Nochlin is. So now we don't have to do that, and handily someone has added in parentheses Baba Batra page Kaf Lamed Zayin Amud Bet, so page 137b, and now a reader of the Talmud needs to know like a little bit less, and less is left up to your guesswork and your searching. But the Tosfot's going to point out that a very parallel case to the one that we're discussing in Sukkah about lulav appears over there by brothers who purchased an etrog together, and this shared ownership question. And now all of a sudden we thought, I'm in Sukkah, I'm talking about rules of holidays. But really, Tosfot says, no, really, we're talking about rules of co-ownership. And that's actually a Nezikin question when we're talking about co-ownership. That's a Baba Batra question. And in fact, in Baba Batra, we see something that's relevant to Moed. We see something that's relevant about the etrog. So that's part one, right? Is that all of a sudden you might have thought, holiday is so different from questions about ownership. And the Tosfot say, no. The Gemara is this one unified whole. And so when we have a question from one, it's going to be related to a question from another. Okay, that's part one of this Gemara, of this Tosfot that, again, we're not learning, but I just want to point out certain things. The second thing that I want to point out is that so now we're in this like second underlined part here, Masha Nahagu HaKahal, right? The practice of the community. So the practice of the community where Tosfot was everyone would buy one etrog collectively. So Tosfot has to say, how does that work? Because everyone on the first day of Sukkot has to own their own etrog. So how does it work that everyone would buy one collectively? That seems like such a problem. And Tosfot goes on to resolve it and suggests that everyone either explicitly or implicitly gifts their fraction of the etrog to their fellows so that whoever is holding it at the time can fulfill the mitzvah as a full owner who's received many fractions of that etrog by way of gifting. But again, this is Tosfot in one Tosfot doing two classic Tosfot things. So one is showing, yes, we're in Moed, we're in Sukkah, but we're also in Bava Batra because the whole Talmud is one conversation, one thing. And two is saying, here's how people are behaving and here's how to make sense of that behavior in light of the Gemara, or here's how the Gemara makes sense in light of that behavior. You can kind of read Tosfot working in both directions. But again, this kind of very beautiful halachis project of the Tosfot as well. I just wanted to point out one more thing before we wrap up, and then we'll take questions. You might have noticed that I've been highlighting in different colors the Gemara as we go through it. So we started out with the stam in purple, quotes from the Torah are in red, and then Tanaitic material is in yellow. And you're going to say, what? There's no Amoraic material? No. So for that, we just didn't get there yet. And that's why you have to come back next week. We're going to continue where we left off from today. We're going to immediately see a story in the Tanaitic material, and then we're going to see a counter story in Amoraic material. So far, we haven't talked at all really about stories, but stories are a delicious, wonderful, exciting part of the Talmud, and we have to understand how the stories and the halacha fit together. We're going to also meet some essential personalities. So we've talked about Rashi, we talked about Devor Ram, but we haven't talked about many of the core characters that appear on every page of the Talmud. We'll do that next week. And then we'll also see, as we go through this page of the Talmud that we're in, we'll see it all starting to flow together. Stam, Tanaitic, Amoraic, halachic teaching, stories, all fitting together in this very beautiful way to teach in this way that's so exciting and so lovely and so core to why I love, and I hope you also love, learning Gemara. So that's what's coming up next time. Please come back next week, and I look forward to continue learning with you.